Good morning. Welcome to another episode of College Coffee Talk. We've been off for a couple of weeks, but we're back. Pearl and Andy Lockwood from Lockwood College Prep. Good morning, Pearl.
Good morning, Andy. Hi, everybody.
We are co-located as we do this live every Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on our Facebook page, lockwoodcollegeprep.com. I'm sorry, facebook.com/Lockwood College Prep. Recently coming off of some sort of Facebook account irregularities message that really messed me up for a couple of weeks, but things seem to be working okay now. So whether you're watching this live or on distant replay, or you're listening to this on our podcast or YouTube or wherever else we shamelessly self-promote, this is the show where we talk about all things college, getting into college, paying for college, SAT, ACT prep, strategies to boost your ability to get in and get funded, get the money that you want and need for college. That's what we're all about on College Coffee Talk. So today we have a show that's a little scary. It's a big show because it's cutting edge stuff. I'm very excited to turn the reins over to my bride, Pearl, here. But before we do that, Pearl, do you have your coffee ready?
I do. My latte.
Okay, well, I'm trying to open mine. I went for we're remote today before Pearl comes into the office. We're teaching a class later that people signed up for. But in the meantime, I grabbed my coffee. I'm sort of like the Ben Affleck of Glen Head, but older, heavier, more Jewishy. Pearl, simultaneous sip, and everyone.
Cheers.
1, 2, 3. Delicious. All right, so if you are with us right now and you have any questions, this is when to pop them in. And let's go, Pearl. Let's get right into it. So, So there's I guess a couple of bills sort of wending their way through Congress that dramatically affect the financial aid rules, regulations, and I guess laws that bear on how much money is going to be available going forward for families in terms of loans, in terms of, I guess, free money like Pell Grants. And there's a whole bunch of other considerations that you will be teaching later, like about an hour on this. But what can you condense for us and tell us what the key changes are and when they happen for people with kids headed to college who are looking to get financial aid?
Well, okay. So as you may or may not have known, recently the Department of Education is consolidated itself, but now is slowly being, I guess, dismantled, or really, we don't really need to say dismantled because then it sort of projects that it's not going to continue to serve in any function. But it appears that the functions of the Department of Education as of now are going to be delegated to maybe the Small Business Association and the IRS, I believe. So here is what is currently, just so you know how much or how little teeth what I'm about to say has. Currently, what I'm about to say, this has already been approved by the House and is on the Senate floor. It is part of the overall reconciliation bill. And the part that is relevant to our discussion, that which deals with college funding, et cetera, just understand that the policies behind this are right now, just to give you an overview, the U.S. government is losing, I believe it's 19 cents or $19 for every loan that they have. So multiply
19 cents on the dollar.
19 cents on the dollar. So they are losing money precipitously under the current existing model in terms of, and what the current existing model is, just briefly.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, which is crazy because they make so much money on interest. There's
right.
$1.6 trillion of student debt out there. and I can't remember the exact figure. I apologize for the amount of interest that they earn, but that is not enough for them to, to cover their own costs as a self-sustaining entity, which is a whole, Doge, Elon Musk thing, which we're not going to get into. But how does this all affect families? Is
right. Of course, but and then the other part of that is apparently 25% of parents who have these parent loans are in default or don't pay the bill. So that's the other part of where the government's left on the hook for what they've lent out.
So there's student loans and there's parent loans that are a problem for the government. And then there's the argument that college costs are out of control because it's just so easy to get money and default.
Right. So let's just touch on that just so people have a context to understand this. Students currently can borrow the following amounts: $5,500 in their own name. That bumps up to $6,500 sophomore year, and then $7,500 per year thereafter of undergraduate studies that the student can borrow in his or her name. So the parent, on the other hand, can borrow as long as they are credit worthy and irrespective of any debt to income ratio analysis, can borrow up to the cost of attendance, which is tuition, room, and board, as determined by the school. So that basically is everything else that the student doesn't borrow or get in his own name. Okay.
Which leads to staggering amounts of debt being piled up by students and parents. And recently, we've talked about this before, but recently you helped someone get out of $274,000 worth of loans. And it's very common for us to see people borrowing $200,000, $300,000 or more.
$500,000. You have more than one kid and a couple of years of private schools for both. There you are.
Right. But people aren't paying them back. And now, they're in, of course, some people are in default. Some people haven't started to have to pay them back. But there's a huge problem, because this administration is now actually requiring people to pay back the loans that they agreed to pay back.
That's correct. So as of May 7th, a couple days ago, they are now going after, it's going to affect your credit if you are not currently enrolled and paying, and have a status of good standing with the government. So, okay. That's what's going on in terms of what currently exists. Here are the proposed changes on the horizon. Okay. On April 28th, the House Education and Workforce Committee released its initial budget proposal and changes. It is called the Student Success and Taxpayers Savings Plan. These changes are set to begin not this upcoming year, but in 26-27. However, as of now, so this is going to include the upcoming graduating class 2026, you're going to be grandfathered in to what currently exists, and the changes I'm about to explain will not affect anybody currently in school, but the upcoming graduates of 2026, the changes will go into effect their senior year of college. So there will be 1 year that they will have to account for. But for 11th graders and down, for your planning, this is hugely and vitally important. And I'll touch back, but your 529s, this is going to be important in terms of how and when you choose to spend it and pay it to the college, because the current options that exist in terms of borrowing are expected to change significantly. I will get back to that.
All right. Okay. Doesn't mean a lot of people don't have 529. So let's just talk about the actual changes.
That's fine. Okay. Whether you do, whether you don't. Right.
Eligibility.
All right. So since that's all right, let me just go through it. All right. Let me go through that first, because that's kind of the biggest. Oh my gosh. All right. Here it goes.
Waiting with bated breath, Pearl.
I know. I've already explained how loans currently work. Here's how they are changing. Undergraduate students will have a lifetime federal loan limit of $50,000, and parents will also have a lifetime federal loan limit of $50,000 per child, which means if you were going to whack up the $50,000 and your child graduates in 4 years, it's about $12,500 per year that the parent can borrow.
So let me interrupt
Whereas,
you.
just to give you real numbers, what I typically see, if a parent is borrowing for the cost of attendance, I'll give you a case study right now. I have a student who attended Rice University. The student takes out right now the $5,500, 60, what currently that student is a junior, $7,500 a year. The parent each year so far in the PLUS loan has borrowed each year $82,000. That is changing from being able to borrow whatever you want to a cap of $12,500 per year, or depending on how you choose to allot the $50,000 per child that you are permitted to borrow. This is where the 529 discussion or considerations have to come in.
Forget about the 529 because not everyone has them.
I know.
Use them. So instead of being able to borrow the whole thing or close to the whole thing, $80,000, $90,000 a year, which people have the ability to do, it's not necessarily the best thing to do.
Right.
They're stuck at a maximum of $50,000 if this actually gets passed.
That's right.
And
by the Senate
and put into law.
That's right.
Okay, and this will start happening in for who and when? One more time.
Okay, this will start for current 2020 for the rising 2026 graduates
of high school graduates
of high school and beyond. It is not going to affect anyone currently enrolled in college, which means even though these changes will go into effect in 2026 for that school year, 26-27, these changes will not affect upperclassmen, if you will.
I will. I will, Pearl.
Okay. Thank you.
This is really okay. So this is tremendous. I'm not saying that in a positive way. I'm just saying like this is a really significant development that I think is going to have. I mean, I don't know what you think, but it's got to have repercussions that shock the whole system. Because number one, what are people going to do to who can't afford to pay the whole price, which is a lot of people who attend a $90,000, $100,000 a year college? Are they going to not go? Are these colleges going to step up and start giving away more free money? Are they going to have to borrow privately on the student loan market, which we don't really get involved with, but that's that's a whole
other application process. Yeah, much more arduous, and would fail a lot of people who pass, so to speak, the PLUS loan test. Yeah, because with the PLUS loan, it doesn't matter what your debt to income ratio is. You can be maxed out on your credit cards and whatever, but as long as you, with significant exception, as long as your credit is fine, good enough, you can borrow whatever you want. That's it. That's the test. Whereas in a private loan, they're going to look at all your assets, all your liabilities, last 2 years of tax returns to see if you can borrow.
Yeah, they're underwriting it, right?
Right.
Yeah, so the PLUS loan was
going to be the same process.
The PLUS loan was barely underwritten. You get people, $80,000 who had their house in like foreclosure proceedings.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So now these loans are going to be, the private loans are going to be strict, and they're going to knock a lot of people out of the box, as you said.
Right.
So either this is going to reduce a whole lot of access for people. I think it will. Yeah. But also,
sorry, go ahead.
It's also going to force colleges to take a hard look at what they're charging. We'll see what happens there, and maybe they'll step it up with fundraising and then boost their endowments, and maybe they'll have more free money to give. But there's a big hypothesis that former Secretary of Education William Bennett said decades ago I think it was under the original George Bush, that the reason college costs are so out of control is because of the easy access to lending. And maybe this is a way to bring those costs under control. Who knows?
Yeah. Another thing that students may be forced to consider, I don't mean forced, but it will end up happening, and it is a wonderful option, consider going to community college for the first 2 years to have a discount and then apply to the school they're hoping to graduate from.
Yeah, maybe there'll be some new funding techniques that happen too. I mean,
that's right.
People still, well, this isn't new, but people still have their home equity in some cases to be able to tap. That's not new, but there are these. It's almost like selling shares in yourself. There are these a few of these investors out there who will front the money in exchange for like 10% of your earnings for your whole life, or some sort of deal like that. I can't remember what that's called off the top of my head, but I've seen stories about that for 5 years or so. That it's almost like you're sponsoring a pro golfer or something, on the front end in exchange for some back end types of return on investment. So who knows what's going to happen out there?
Yeah, no, this is very similar to the housing market crash in 2008, in that before 2008, anyone could kind of get a mortgage for any old house they wanted, because there was you can just state what your income was, and you can just state what your assets were, and it was a handshake and and you were approved. So then, of course, because the restrictions were so low as they are currently in terms of how one can get that much money in a matter of moments to essentially potentially borrow what they're not really going to be able to sustain and pay back come 4.5 years later when the obligation is upon you. Thereafter, the housing rules became very, very strict, and then a lot of people were forced to borrow less, buy a less expensive home, et cetera, because it was tied to their current debt and income obligations or realities. The same thing, it looks like the government is trying to push people back into some kind of responsibility here in terms of paying or what they're able to borrow in the first place, so that people don't bite off more than they can chew.
Yeah, and I think there's another philosophical theory behind it, which is that all these loans aren't being paid and some aren't being forgiven. That ultimately the obligation to pay those goes to the taxpayers, right? If the Department of Ed is losing 19 cents or 18 cents on the dollar everywhere, that doesn't mean that it just gets lost and no one pays for it. No, we pay for that in higher taxes.
Yeah.
So I think there's a public policy statement being made there as well. The flip side is this will absolutely, if it goes through the way you're describing it, will absolutely reduce access to college for a lot of people.
Yes.
But it's unclear whether, because that's just an across the board statement. When you look at it individually, I'm not so sure that's a bad thing, right? Because we see people, and I'm not judging here, but I'm trying not to judge here, but we see people making decisions that we wouldn't make in terms of sending their kids to a school that's $80,000 or $90,000 a year, but it's not, it's not an elite school. It might be a school that admits 50% or more of its applicants, as opposed to going to a, here in New York, a SUNY or wherever they reside, the equivalent, a state university. So maybe this policy is going to boost enrollment at the local state, universities at every state where people normally would have tried to get out of by borrowing their way into a private university. Who knows?
Yeah. Which brings me to other important. So that's a huge big deal, and that's what we started with. I just want to discuss a couple other things that are changing, that are certainly potentially changing. Let me just potential changes.
Yeah.
Here's what else is on the horizon. The student aid index, which is the number that is produced when one submits a FAFSA. It's on your confirmation page, and that number, called the Student Aid Index, SAI, is a starting point for all schools who then use their own financial aid process to determine an aid package. What that number essentially determines is, yes, you are need eligible, or no, you're not need eligible, and where exactly you fall, et cetera, on some sliding scale. Okay. Currently, if you're a business owner or a farm owner, that asset value is included on the FAFSA. Value of that is penalized somewhat in terms of your financial aid eligibility. That is actually going away. They are no longer, the proposed bill will no longer include the asset value of a small business or farm. So that's very pro small business and farm. This is a big one. Federal funding, the cost of attendance, which is how the loan is determined, when it's based on need, is actually no longer going to be based on the cost of the school. Rather, it's going to be based on the cost of your program at that school. So there are going to be distinctions based on what the student chooses to study.
So if they're enrolled in a more expensive program, they're likely to be more eligible for aid compared to if they were in a less expensive program?
Depending on what they study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
So going back to the small business thing. So the SAI, which used to be the EFC, it was that way for decades until last year when they changed it to the Student Aid Index.
Right.
That's the number that the government thinks you should be able to apply to pay for college.
Right.
So in terms of, how it's based on income and savings and all that stuff, are there any, the small business thing is pretty big because that's a reversal of what used to be. But I want to ask you about the other stuff in a second. So let's say I don't know if you know this answer yet, but let's say that you have a business entity that holds real estate in there. Do you think that is, are we going to be trying to claim that small business has a zero value because it's an LLC that owns a property like down the street?
If the rule is if the underlying provisions of this rule, it just says SAI will not include the asset value of a small business or farm. Okay. Period.
It doesn't define small business or farm at this point?
No, but it just for our audience, small business use under these financial aid rules, used to be considered any business that had fewer than 100 employees.
Okay.
So what Andy is getting at is if you're what you're getting at, if one does not personally own an investment property, but rather owns it in an LLC, for example, that parent is the owner of, owns the LLC that has an asset of that investment property. What this says is that value of that business, the value of that business's assets, do not come into play on the FAFSA. That being said, just be mindful, the income from that business that flows to your personal tax return, however, will be considered.
Right, but most real estate people have a lot of depreciation, so in many cases they show losses or minimal income, so that may not be a big thing. However, my hunch is that they're going to flesh that out and say, once again, well, that's owning real estate is not the same as having a business, but
that's true.
We'll see. But that was the cool thing, like you alluded to, is that was an exemption that we used to have all the time with our clients up until 2 years ago. And then it got reversed, and now it's being reverted back to the original small business exemption. So that's very small. That's very pro small business.
Exactly. So somebody who has that situation, and you're wondering, this is a potential consideration, retitling the business, your asset, if you're able to, into the name of a business.
Okay. So any other changes to eligibility in terms of how much income they're counting, or the
Other things, yeah.
or the assets, or the asset protection, any of these types of things that you think are worthy of discussing now, if we even
Yes.
know about them?
Yes. Okay. This is another big one. Frequently, we have small business owners. This is potentially to round out what we just were talking about. We have some small business owners that show very, very little income on their returns. However, they have a ton of assets, which, nonetheless, if their income only is judged for federal benefits like the Pell Grant, they could have millions in assets that are not really being factored in. And there's some unfairness there that I think this bill sets to address. What's going to happen is, going forward, the Pell Grant the calculation would include assets as part of the SAI, Student Aid Index, not just income. So that's a big change for some who were, getting the Pell. I don't know what it would do to the state limits, but here's the other. Subsidized loans. And I'll just briefly describe the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized loans. Subsidized loans are loans that the student, the undergraduate student, can borrow in his or her name, as I just described. And part of that, depending on lower income, part of that $5,500, let's say $3,500, is called an unsubsidized loan, and $2,000 is called a subsidized loan. The difference between those, interest as to the unsubsidized portion, that loan, $3,500, interest will begin to accrue while the student is in college. On the other hand, as to the $2,000 that is subsidized, the government is subsidizing that interest while that student is in college. So there is no interest accrual on the subsidized portion of that loan. Now that I just explained that, subsidized loans are going to be eliminated as of July 1st, 2026. But again,
same timing as everything else you're saying?
Yes. Yep. Of course, the exception to this are the currently enrolled students. Again, this is not affecting them. All right. Let me just see if there's any other thing. I told you about the lifetime limits. Let me just see. There is going to be this is getting into the weeds a little, but as to loan repayment programs, there's going to be a new, replacing the others, income-driven repayment method, which is not that different. Of course, it has a new name and a new acronym. It's called the Repayment Assistance Plan, RAP, which uses the borrower's reported adjusted gross income, and they will still be able to file married and separate, isolating the borrower's income for purposes of income-based repayment plans, now or potentially soon to be called RAP, Repayment Assistance Plan. What else can I tell you?
Let's just sum up here, because we're sure. Now slightly over time here. So there's not necessarily
one last thing I want to say that matters. As to this,
go ahead.
As to loan forgiveness programs, public service loan forgiveness, those are going to be exactly the same, with a big exception. Medical and dental residence loans after June 30th, 2025 will not qualify for public service loan forgiveness anymore.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. So everything you've talked about today is, just to sum up here, is about dramatic changes to federal aid eligibility. So yes. on one hand, at least for a lot of the people that we talk to, that's a very small bucket, even though this seems like a huge, outrageous change. But most of the money out there comes from colleges' own endowments, and I'm talking about private colleges and universities who don't adhere only to the federal rules because they have their own money. So that's going to be, I believe, going to be unaffected. I think this is a policy statement that says we're not going to be responsible for going bankrupt and losing 18 cents on the dollar for student aid anymore. It's not sustainable, right? So
That's correct.
it's going to change things, but not necessarily for people who are applying to colleges that have their own money, or colleges that will be going on a fundraising spree to raise their own money. But for the people who are reliant on federal funds, particularly parent loans, which we do see, unfortunately, a lot of people take, then this is going to really shut the spigot from being able to borrow, $300,000, $400,000 to a total of $50,000 max per student, right? For all of the years, not per year.
That is correct. 50
50
total.
Yeah,
per
that's
child.
So that's big. I mean, that's, people need to start planning for that, and maybe listening to what the colleges themselves are going to be doing. I'm sure they will start issuing statements about this as the bill gets closer to being signed. I believe President Trump is expected to sign this into law if it does get through, right? Both committees and houses and parts of Congress.
Yep.
So there's going to be a lot of rethinking about college decisions as well. It's going to be more important to claw every last dollar that you can from these colleges, particularly the ones with their private endowments. So that means being strategic about filling out your financial aid applications. You've got the federal one, the FAFSA, but then there's the institutional application, the CSS profile, which Pearl's an expert on. She handles forms for 400 families plus per year. So it's going to be really important to have an expert like her in your corner, but it's also going to be equally important to really think hard about is it really worth stepping up and sending your child to a college that's $90,000 that you can't borrow for, at least from federal funds? You have to, look at other sources which may not be as palatable as the federal funds, which are, they're not super low interest rates, but they're pretty competitive in my opinion, because there's no security, there's no collateral. So it's very interesting times that we're heading into.
I hear the interest rates are actually, but I don't want to speak too soon because it's going to be announced in like a week, but I think they're going to be a drop lower than they were this year. So that's a smidge of good news.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, great. Okay. Well, we covered a lot of ground and there's so much more to talk about, but we have to shut down here. Thanks for watching or listening, whatever you're doing, maybe both, hopefully. And we will be back. I don't think we're going to be back next week because we're at a golf outing, right?
Oh.
So we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of College Coffee Talk. In the meantime, if you subscribe and like and whatever you have to do on whatever platform that you're on, then you will see us when we go live, and you won't miss out on any news like this. We're still having issues with Facebook, and for some reason this event wasn't posted. I don't think it was on our page, even though we did it the same way we always do. So the best way to make sure you never miss out is to be alerted when we go live. Okay. Pearl, good job. I'll see you in the office.
See you in the office. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye.